Hello and welcome to this discussion on reporting on migration. As you might know, the IndiaSpend School of Data Journalism and India Migration Now have just launched a course on mapping migration. This comes at a time when images of thousands of Afghans desperate to flee their country have been splattered across our screens and newspapers. The fallouts of this crisis are likely to be felt in neighboring countries, as well as countries elsewhere that are supportive of migration for a long time to come. As for India, we know that India is home to millions of migrants from its neighboring countries and also sends out millions of immigrants across the world every year. As such, understanding migration is key to understanding this moment in our history, our political economy, and our development. With this, I welcome today's panelists, Varun Agarwal, founder and CEO of India Migration Now, Professor Babu Bhagat, professor and head of the Department of Migration and Urban Studies at the International Institute for Migration Studies in Mumbai, and my colleague Shreehari Paliath, data analyst and reporter with a special interest in migration. Varun, help us kickstart with an understanding of what's happening in Afghanistan right now and how that is likely to affect India.
Sure, Madhur, and thanks for having me. I think what's happening in Afghanistan has been happening to different intensities now since the late 70s. The country has been in conflict, first with the Soviets, then the first incarnation of the Taliban, then the American and the NATO occupation, and now again, the latest incarnation of the Taliban. There's been constant turmoil and conflict, and waves after waves of people have left that country. This is just the latest episode, point being in a series of exodus Afghanistan has seen in its modern sort of contemporary times. I think what's happening today is, like I said, is you have a mixture of talented, skilled, but also progressive people who were friendly to the regime, the American and the NATO regime, who feel threatened by the presence of Taliban. There's a lot of women who sort of fit into all of this, and they're trying to now. Always the initial exodus in any kind of forced migration context, which is what is happening in Afghanistan currently, is to first internally, so it's a kind of a IDP, internally displaced situation. The second is to neighboring countries. So for the longest time in Afghan history, most of its refugees were in Pakistan or Iran. And even like the Taliban today, which is in power, while the NATO was in power, many of the folks who contribute in what we call the Taliban were in Pakistan. So this has been, so this is what we're going to see even now. There's going to be a very small number of people who can actually go to the US or the Western countries because they won't be accepted and it's too expensive or difficult for them to go by air. Most of what we see Afghanis doing is go through land routes via Pakistan into perhaps India, South Asia, or via Iran into Turkey, and then eventually Europe. And we've been seeing this even when the Syrian crisis was happening. We saw a lot of Afghanis sort of exit Afghanistan, go via Turkey or Iran to the routes the Syrians had financed into Europe. So we expect that to be the pattern. We also see a lot of Afghanis who do qualify under UNHCR definition of being a refugee come into India, and that's what we have in India, for instance, today. Are a lot of small but important population of Afghanis like Little Kabul and Delhi. All of them have sort of come through the UNHCR route, but typically they prefer to either go to the neighboring countries or directly apply for asylum in Western countries. So that's where we are with Afghanistan today.
Thank you. You mentioned internally displaced persons. Could you quickly help us understand the difference between IDPs, internally displaced persons, refugees, and migrants?
Well, I think there's a legal dimension to this, and then there is the migration studies, the way we view it there, which is what the course is all about. the legal dimensions have a very distinct, and UNHCR, for instance, often pushes back when we conflate migrants with refugees, because the rhetoric and the legal definitions are very sensitive to this. Because if you're a migrant, you won't be qualifying under UNHCR refugee laws or the Refugee Geneva Convention. So they tend to take a very specific view where you are leaving your country and you're going to another country because of issues with security or display, largely around violence or political persecution. These are sort of the reasons which qualify you under UNHCR, what we call the legal definition of refugees, and many countries sort of align with that because this all is derived from the Geneva Convention. With IDPs, again, there's no official definition, but in migration studies and a lot of the people who work in conflict, it's about being a refugee, but you're within your national borders. You're not crossing international borders. So you're going from Kabul, you're from Kandahar, you're getting to Kabul to escape what's happening there. So that's kind of an IDP situation. You're still within Afghan borders, but you're being forced to leave your home. And this happens not just because of conflict, this can happen because of development. We have in India cases where dams are built and people are displaced because of water occupying and flooding their villages, and they have to move somewhere else. So this development-induced, what you call IDPs. You can have political persecution, religious persecutions. There are many different reasons, but it's all about happening within a country's border. A migrant, ultimately, from a migration studies perspective, everybody's a migrant because you're leaving your home, you're going to another place, you're changing your residence, right? Your reasons might be voluntary or involuntary, but it's happening all under the migration sort of framework. And I think that's the distinction between the legal approach, where a lot of migration scholars get pushed back from advocates and activists and legal scholars. But within the migration study, how we conceptualize this is that all of it comes under the superset called migration. So yeah, that's the distinctions.
Right, thank you, Varun. Ram, my next question is to you. Can you help us understand migration in India, both outward and inbound? What are the key issues and challenges?
Yeah, thank you, Madhur, and for inviting me. Actually, if you see what is migration, migration is a movement of people from one place to another. And people move for livelihood, for education, for marriages, even for recreation. So there are many purposes for which people move from one place to another. But these are voluntary migration. So what Varun has said was a forced migration. So under forced migration, we have refugees, we have asylum seeker, we have internally displaced person, and we have also trafficked persons. All these are forced migrants, and actually their rights are violated. So if you see migration as such, it's very important to understand it has both dimensions. It can enhance freedom and it can create bondage. And that's why I like to emphasize our constitution, where it says under Article 19 that right to move is a fundamental right of every person. But that right must enhance freedom of opportunity like livelihood or employment or education or capability. It can empower people, make available various choices and capability formation so that human development can happen. But that is not happening actually. So I will give precisely something related with internal migration, and then I will little bit talk about international migration from voluntary perspective. What Varun has talked about, it was a forced migration, and there are laws internationally, particularly UN system, United Nations is taking care of under UNHCR, and we have Compact for Refugee, we have Universal Declaration of Human Rights 1948. All these are applicable for the forced migration. Now, internal migration, if you look at, we have huge internal migration. India's population 37% of about 450, but it consists of many, not only employment, but all other aspects what I have told you. But even if you see the labor force and what we are talking and what we have seen during the pandemic, people moving on the road and going desperate to go their homes, these were the interstate migrants. They were belonging to one state, but working in another state. This is huge. There are 60 million people in India who are living and working in other states of India. So, and if you see, it is related with urbanization, big city, where there is a employment opportunity, and also where people can get, can enhance income, etc. Now, labor force of urban area, if you see, about 55% of the labor force of urban area sorry, constitutes migrant worker, 55%. It's a very large. But every migrant worker is not vulnerable. So migrant workers are also not homogeneous. Some are very permanent, some are very educated, some are very professionals. They can take care of. But there is a group of migrants who are seasonal and temporary, who are just circulating between origin and destinations, and for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months in a year and going back. So they are not permanent, what we call it seasonal and temporary migrants. And that also constitute very large number. And although official statistics gives very small number, around 12 or 13 million, but it is very large, maybe 30 to 40 million people. So it's a very large number of people, and this is the migrant category which needs protection. Now, what is protection? Again, I like to invite your attention towards the Article 19 of the Constitution, or the fundamental right. Their citizenship rights are violated. So first citizenship right is the political exclusion. Are they voters? Yes, they are voters. Are their names included in voter list? No. Many of them, their name is not included in voter list. Suppose their name is also included in voter list, but if they are staying in Mumbai and Delhi at the time of election, they cannot go and cast their vote. But you have seen that our leaders on the day flying from Delhi, going to Ahmedabad, going to Bangalore, and casting their vote. That type of opportunity is not there for migrant workers. So that is fundamental question of portability of voting rights. Why I am emphasizing this? People are only talking about economic rights, social rights, labor rights. But if people don't have this political rights, they are not visible. They don't have identity. And if they don't have identity, they don't have respect. They need to be respected, and first, their voting rights and their political exclusion, that should be addressed. Now, related with political exclusion, there are social rights, social security programs, you know, we have been talking about, and government also listened about social security programs and portability of ration card, portability of health insurance, rental housing. All these have come during the discussion during last few months, but it has not taken shape, because one nation, one ration card. Now, one nation, how can you apply or make applicable one nation, one ration card without splitting the ration card? Migrants are not moving with entire family. Part of the family is there in villages, in origin. And you say portability, you bring your ration card here. So migrant cannot get. So you have to split the ration card for migrant, ration card for left behind, state back family. That's what. The same thing is happening in health insurance. Ayushman Bharat. Oh, Ayushman Bharat, we have given 5 lakh coverage. But what about if migrant is here and the cards to be used at a place of origin? So all these need to be addressed. Rental housing is very, very important, but there is no progress so far I know. But there are discussions going on. This pandemic has created a consciousness. I think, let us hope something will happen. But these are some of the things, very small things, but this can give more respect. More fundamental thing is that how we design our rural development, how we initiate or plan our urban development, so that migrants can be becoming part of the city. That is what we call right to the city. Because in the city, wealth is created, income is there, employment opportunity, our 70% GDP also coming, percent of the GDP coming from the cities. And so migrants are very important, 1/3 of the workforce, and also contributing to the creation of the GDP, who are migrant workers. So therefore, this whole issue of urban inclusion, that is ultimately to be focused urban area as linked with development of rural area. So this is overall policy of planning and development, but addressing migrants' portability rights, social security rights, portability of political voting rights, I think that must begin now and to start with. Now, these are what I said about it is about external migrants also, we have international migrants. And very contrastingly, international migrants originate from developed states of India. That is how is the contrast. Developed states like Punjab, Gujarat, Kerala, all these where international migrants have originated, and half of them are working in Middle East. Now we also see that from UP, Bihar also, people are going. So there is the expansion, horizontal expansion. And we also talk about remittances, and a lot of remittances, India earning about $80 billion or something. And it's a huge amount, and it provides foreign exchange, etc. But these people there are huge family costs also. And during the pandemic, about 1 million people returned to Kerala. Kerala, of course, contributes about half of the immigrants. And 1 million if returning, and if there is no plan or state government is not empowered. So somewhere I think there is a need to have a policy how to integrate them, reintegrate them, and provide some maybe well off, but they maybe need various type of other support system, may not be capital. They may, some of them may be highly skilled, but they need certain support, certain opportunity, so that their skills can be utilized. So these are challenges, but state-specific challenges. We have diversity, and center state need to work together on migration issues. And then I think migration can be integrated with human development strategy.
Thank you. I think that is where journalism's role becomes more important. Varun, were you saying something?
If I could, just a couple of small points before Shreehari speaks, if that's all right. Just to pick up on what Dr. Bhagat was saying, and I'm tied up to the Afghanistan piece because I think it's also relevant to what's going on right now, which is this whole politics of knowledge production, but also politics of what we like. Even the UNHCR, their approach is not questioned. Then they're well-meaning. They play a very important role. This is not to undermine what they do, but it's also limited in what they do. For instance, quite often, a lot of Afghanis would first move to under duress, will move to Pakistan or Iran, but then they get there, they feel relatively safer, right? Physically safer. They feel, okay, we're not going to be attacked, our families are safe, but then they don't have the economic opportunities in these countries. Then they apply for asylum, or then they try and migrate to Europe or US or Canada, or perhaps even India, right? And I think, and then we call them economic migrants. They're no longer refugees. So I mean, you see how the idea of what we call refugees and the way we define why someone migrates is so problematic, especially when we try and condense it into legal definitions. There are limitations on how we can these definitions, and even the sort of the more empirical practices that we see in social sciences, to tie it back to Dr. Bhagat's point, which are unable to grasp the everyday experiences and choices that migrants, especially in forced situations, face. And Afghanis are real, and I've seen it firsthand from the work I did when I was in Brussels. I was a part of a welcome group for Afghanis, and this was a common thing. They were actually much like us, policy experts in Kabul, who were leaving Kabul because they felt they didn't feel safe, and when they felt safe, they didn't have the opportunity. That's like, I would like to work in Brussels and do something for my country back home. So they were not strictly refugees, and they were really struggling getting asylum as a result. But where do we draw a line? And this is where the limitations of the legal approaches and even some of the political rhetoric come into play. But this also plays out in sort of like the economic discipline and a more rigid empirical sort of approaches. So I think it's important for us to recognize that. And the implications also all of this has, I think if you look at with the CAA, where we are saying that certain kind of refugees can come, and that what we call a refugee is still inspired from the UNHCR, but now we're limiting it, we're filtering it based on religious identity, right? So again, the limitations in sort of the way we're imagining who needs our help, and I think it's important for us to keep that in mind, and how this comes from what Dr. Bhagat was referring to as a politics of social science and knowledge production. Yeah, I just wanted to make that point. And one last thing is in terms of immigrants coming back to India, immigrants from India coming back to India, and how they're lacking opportunities, and it's very interesting development. I think it's worth flagging what's happening in Telangana and in Andhra, but especially Telangana, where a political party is being formed at the state level by return migrants. It's one of the first sort of development of this kind we ever seen, and I think this is actually just sort of reinforces what Dr. Bhagat was saying, where people feel they need to now sort of act and fight for their rights, because they're now for the first time identifying themselves across religious and caste boundaries, saying, look, we are return migrants and we have a common sort of struggle. And all they say is that we just want our voice to be heard. So it's interesting that he flagged that, because we see the political sort of developments, implications that are already taking place in certain states, right?
Wow, lots of layers to peel back. I'm sure all these issues make this field all the more interesting to cover. So I'll turn now to Shreehari to ask how, as a reporter covering migration in India, how does one begin to research the subject, given all these ambiguities, the lack of clear data? What should one keep in mind? Where does one look for one's research and data, Shreehari?
Yeah, I mean, like Dr. Bhagat and Varun said, it's pretty complex and pretty complicated to understand that space, because almost every aspect can be, can come under the migration umbrella. It's actually very important to understand, like Dr. Bhagat said, the issue in popular conception when we talk about migrants is usually labor and migrant workers. It doesn't just stop there. The issue is around political inclusion. It's about social security, welfare, healthcare, education of migrants, their children. Almost anything can be analyzed. Any governance challenge can be analyzed when we talk about migration. And there is a gap. I mean, at a government level, in the public space, in public memory, there is a gap. I mean, we've seen that fallout last year when the government announced the lockdown, and when we saw the mass exodus of these were largely migrant workers who were right at the bottom of the economy. But we saw, a large number of people going back, stranded in work destinations, not being able to access basic entitlements, and many of the images that we saw were unfair and inhumane in a lot of ways. And in such a situation, I mean, given that there is a lack of data, there are two options available for us as journalists, especially when we look at data as data journalists or with a focus on data. One is government data, which we have quite adequately established is not available, or it's limited, it's not timely, the quality of data may not actually pose any kind of make any kind of research actually viable. So in such a situation, the other option that we have is to reach out to experts like Dr. Bharat and organizations like IMN, others who work, others like social activists, NGOs who work around the issue of migration, challenges to livelihood, migrant work, etc. Which is my go-to, because when you don't have data, what do you then do? I mean, for example, the census data that we were talking about, it's almost a decade old, although parts of it were only released a couple of years ago. It had all kinds of gaps. The NSS survey data was released in 2007. Then there are other government commission reports and working committee reports that has some amount of data, but they largely rely on dated information. In such a situation, what you ideally have to do is pick and choose the issues that you want to actually go in depth, ensure that the voices of many of these migrants and migrant groups, given that some of them face unique issues, and make sure that this narrative comes out. We capture this sensitively, given the present situation of the pandemic, and ensure that this is backed by expert voices, researchers, and activists who are closely working with these communities and these groups.
Great. Can you give us some examples of some of the stories that you've written?
Yeah, I mean, one of the recent stories that I did was on migrant workers in and around the Delhi NCR region. This was recently, I mean, during the peak of the second wave, Feb onwards. I mean, the thing now is that, since COVID, it's not too difficult to conceptualize stories because the context is always COVID, and it is always in and around or in relation to COVID. So I just wanted to understand what was happening to these, families of migrant workers, migrant communities who are there in large numbers in many of the metros, especially in the Delhi NCR region, and how they were coping with during the second wave. This was a time when many of them had not worked for months together, and then when the second wave happened, there were multiple local lockdowns. Many of them were desperate to sort of go back home, but they were unable to do that because they didn't have adequate savings. When the national lockdown happened last year, although they were taken by surprise, the thing was that they had some amount of savings. They could borrow money from friends or get it transferred from family. But now almost everybody, including the government machinery, had been impacted, especially in the Delhi area. There were high fatalities, infection rates. There was a fair amount of fear. So in that situation, the only option that we have is to reach out to some of these workers and try to figure out what they have to say firsthand. What kind of vulnerabilities are they talking about? And what they thought would be important in order for the government to hear them. The other aspect here was that data is not, available because the situation is constantly changing. So in that situation, what do you do? I mean, again, a few volunteer network groups that work with migrants, came to my rescue. They had some amount of data that was available because they had open phone lines and they were taking complaints and distress calls from many of these workers. They were liaising with government departments, etc. So, so there was some limited amount of information, data that nicely weaved in with what the migrants and their families had to say. And which was in stark contrast to a lot of things that they thought were relevant during March of last year, March onwards, when the national lockdown was announced. So it gave a fair comparison of what the problems are.
Thank you, Shreehari. Varun, your team have written a lot of stories for us also, making use of whatever data there is available, and some of them have been very powerful stories indeed. Would you like to share some of those stories with us? Maybe just a brief overview of some of the stories you like the best.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the IndiaSpend platform has been fantastic to sort of like some of the complexities we have sort of painted here to take some of these, for instance, the other issues Dr. Bhagat and Shreehari have spoken about, internal migrants. So we were able to, for instance, really use the IndiaSpend sort of platform to talk about the Interstate Migrant Policy Index, which I conceptualized, which basically breaks down the various policy areas both Bhagat sir and Shreehari have sort of, very articulated and are relevant for all kinds of migrants, especially for internal migrants. So really sort of bring that forward to provide a sense of all these relevant policy areas. What are different state governments from a destination perspective doing? How does that relate to the experiences of migrants? So it's not just about the data or the policy analysis, but also how that relates to on the ground experiences. And this was really sort of the seminal piece for us with IndiaSpend, which sort of placed this agenda of integration, which is what we call migration studies, or you can say inclusion, like Bhagat sir and Shreehari said, like, social inclusion, political inclusions, from education perspective, all the sort of state level sort of inclusion mandates or the lack of them. We were able to sort of paint that, and then that baseline has been, we've done now pieces on specific kind of workers and how these, once we have this vocabulary of integration will establish IndiaSpend, we've been able to do focus on textile workers. We've been able to focus stories on construction workers and their realities and how that ties back to, again, this index and these areas of exclusion or inclusion. So I think a lot of the pieces we have done have sort of followed this thematic. But the other great opportunity with IndiaSpend has been that we're not just focused on internal migrants. We've been able to sort of really extend our own mandate of migration into India, for instance, and talk about the Rohingya experiences and their integration challenges. And again, there's an index we worked, which inspired IMPEX, which is the MyPEX, the global index, where we were able to sort of include India in that index and really apply that again in the context of Rohingyas and other kinds of forced migrants who India is hosting, right? And finally, also about immigrants to India. We've done stories on recruitment and Gulf migrants and international migration and how the Indians are treated in their relationship with India, right? So I think for me, these thematics and which is sort of the heart of what we do in India migration now have been sort of, been able to be presented and articulated on the IndiaSpend platform. And I think for us, the great thing about this is that it's given us a chance to sort of define the vocabulary, sort of give frameworks to deal with complexity. And I think the course right now is just, a much more sort of elaborate yet condensed version of all those stories to help journalists and anybody who wants to report on migration sort of tackle and grasp the sort of the complexities and hopefully have some precision and a framework, but also able to critique our own work. I think what's great is journalists can tell human stories and show the limitations of the politics that perhaps we are propagating through our work, right? We try to be open-minded, but we also have our biases. So I think that's what's great journalism can do, and we look forward to that engagement going forward.
Great. I'm going to pose a question to Ram again now. Ram, as a reader, but also as an expert, when you read stories on migration, do you ever grind your teeth or get really angry at what journalists are just not getting or what they're getting wrong? Can you tell us?
Yes. There is it's a very important question, I think, and how we present our stories in journal, in newspapers and elsewhere, I think very important. First thing is that there is a strong narrative on migration. And what is this narrative is that everybody is trying to condemn migration. Oh, migrants are exploited, this is happening, that is happening. So net result is what? Don't allow migration, prevent migration. So you find that Hindi word for migration is palayan. Palayan. And if you ask any politician in Jharkhand or Bihar or in somewhere that is there any palayan from your area? They will say, no, there is no palayan. So there is no exodus. No, we are able to give employment. So I think this excessive negative attitude, we have to realize that migration is a livelihood strategy. People don't have livelihood opportunity. People are migrating. But it doesn't mean those who are staying back are good. They are also in deplorable condition. And therefore, while bringing out these exclusions, condemnations, etc., we have to see this is a one opportunity, and opportunity of basket should be provided more and more. Choices should be there. One choice is this is one choice. So I think this is bringing out certain things of positive aspects of migration is also necessary, but a balanced view. Researchers are also doing the same thing. They will start condemning, or our students are also doing same thing in big seminars, also in big discussion. Also, everybody is trying to lament migration. But that's why I highlight that Constitution empowers us. Right to move is a fundamental right. How this can be realized through political, social, and other empowerments. That is, I think, and it can provide choice, and choice can make. It will be a means of capability formation, and then capability will also enhance choices. If you have more capability, we can have more choices also. That is, I think, the development perspective, human development perspective, journalists should take and bring forth the issue of migration.
And just if I can share one gripe, and I think this is a general narrative gripe, which just to extend Dr. Bhagat's point, which is it's not just about the people who are migrating. It's also about the people who are not able to migrate or want to migrate. I think the immobility problem, which I think was the hidden tragedy, real tragedy of the first lockdown, where it was not just about the people who had to go back, but also people who couldn't migrate at the time when they do want to migrate, and the livelihood implications of that. And I think that is sort of played out in sort of multifold ways. And I think a lot of the poverty figures that are coming out from various surveys, especially CMI surveys, highlight that. I think they're highlighting the fact that a lot of people who want to migrate or their contractors who facilitate the migration have been devastated in the last 18 months and can't migrate. And what will that do to a generation of aspirations in areas where people want to migrate from? So how can storytelling bring that forward? And I think this is where frameworks, and that doesn't say the course tries to offer a framework to think about that, to sort of bust the narrative and maybe think more about possibilities of stories that you can find beyond the usual sort of traps you fall into when we talk about migration, which Bhagat highlighted really well.
Right. Shreehari, you're the journalist here on the panel. What can you tell us? Do you have any tips or suggestions on how to avoid these pitfalls? How does one get a story right?
It is it is slightly difficult. Based on the issue that you're looking at, but the most basic thing that you need to do is to research adequately. Given there are all kinds of complexities. I can give you an example of a story that I had done on gig workers, and this wasn't supposed to be a migrant story. It was about how the work conditions of gig workers, especially food delivery executives, drivers with cab aggregators, and what they were facing. This was a few years before COVID, I think sometime in 2019. And during conversations, you start realizing, this story was done in Bangalore, mostly. And during conversations, you start realizing that many of these people are migrants who've come here for what, better work opportunities. There was inadequate income in the other districts that they're working in the neighboring states around Karnataka. And many of them were farmers, and there was absolutely no way that their small parcels of land would be adequate for their families to survive. So you start seeing this interlinking of issues, and you start understanding what these factors are when you're you start speaking and engaging with this community. So first and foremost is, of course, the research aspect of it, and then to ensure that whichever community, whichever group you're engaging with, be it refugees, be it immigrant workers, let's say from Nepal, or internal migrants, there is adequate engagement with them so that we can sensitively capture what they're trying to say. Maybe you can't directly speak to them, there are limitations, logistical limitations, but probably through groups, let's say, IMN has projects, other activists who are working around migration have, networks. They have a lot of input. So all this helps you capture, what the thinking is, what the current thinking is, what government policy can be. And that adds to the narrative, adds to a valuable narrative, and not just present a bunch of numbers or data. Talking about data, the other aspect is ever since COVID, there is an issue of relevance of data, because there is data that might have been relevant up until 2019, end of 2019. Post-COVID, a lot of issues have changed. There's a fall of income, there's lack of, there's underemployment, there's unemployment. How the gender aspect of it, are people actually working more in, government schemes like Manrega? So we need to make sure that we pick relevant data and make sure that, that adds to the context, and not, use data just because it's simply available. It needs to be used smartly.
Right, great, thank you. Any final words, Varun and Ram, for those journalists and researchers who are going to take our course on mapping migration?
Yeah, well, I hope you take it, and I hope you're able to finish the module, and I hope it's engaging. So, that would be a good win. I think, of course, the definitions and both, what I would love is for them to be critical sort of observers of what has been presented in the course, because And as Dr. Bhagat, spoke about, there is a limitation and a particular perspective that, when we talk about migration, so we need to, what I'm hoping the course can do is really give you a sense of what we know, but also what we don't know, get some clarity on that front. A lot of your work will be applying what you know to investigate what we don't know, right? And that's where the storytelling is really important. What I'm also hopeful is that they can understand and locate the lives of migration amongst the noise that's out there, and understand the kind of stakeholders who they can talk to. So it's not just about us as organizations, as Shreehari mentioned, but also employers and migrants themselves and their social networks. We talk a lot about that, identify them. Hopefully these are sort of key informants for you, your news sources going forward when you're trying to do these stories. So give you those tips. And finally, to give you, again, it's about frameworks. What frameworks and models and theory does, it opens possibilities. That's the function ultimately. None of them are perfect. It's all a living sort of, every theory is a living document, a living concept. And what I'm hoping is that they're able to get the best in sort of a best in class idea of what's happening, and then do the reporting and then we learn from that, like I said, and update those models going forward. So really sort of able to get that jugalbandi going with the reporters and the academics.
Yes, I'd be very excited to read the stories that come out of this course. Ram, your final words.
Yes. So I think we are talking about labor migration for last several months, and during the pandemic, it has become came into limelight. So that is fine, I think. And I quoted two figures. I think I will repeat if there is a confusion. I said that 50% of the urban workforce is migrant workers, and overall in the economy, 30% are migrant workers. So this is a huge number. So when we are talking about policy, and I think it is going in right direction, we do not need a migration policy, because Constitution already says about migration. We need a policy for migrants. And I have seen that Niti Aayog's document, and it says that yes, there should be a policy for migrants, not for migration. So migration and migrant, we need to make a distinction between the two. One is non-negotiable. Migration is our right, fundamental right. So that is one thing. Second is that we are not talking about within state migration. There are a large number of migrants within state moving, and we have very big state. And Varun has rightly pointed out, we need to do industry specific more. Who are the contractors? How migrants are brought? So we have a Interstate Migrant Workmen Act, and now the labor codes are there, where there is a provision or there is a definition of migrant. So there are a lot of stories that can come from the field, from the grassroots level, and we can make a big story, and then the data comes into the picture, the NSSO and all these things. And those data are more for us to say that yes, these many numbers are migrant, or they're more structural characteristics. So I think journalists can play a very important role to construct and to make very important stories, which is coming from the grassroots level.
Great. Thank you, Ram, Varun, and Shreehari for this lively and very insightful discussion. I think we're all closing with a lot to think about, and I really hope that those taking this course on mapping migration will take away from this discussion what a wealth of stories there are out there to be covered, and covered well. Thank you.